Hey guys, welcome to another lesson video. Today we're going to pick up where we left off talking about the Roman Catholic Church. So make sure that you're filling in your fill in the blank notes as we go along, because there's a lot of interesting information today about how the Roman Catholic Church had a huge impact on the way people lived and also on all kinds of cultural aspects of the Middle Ages. Let's get started. Today we're going to jump in and take a look at how during the Middle Ages art and architecture was greatly influenced by the Roman Catholic Church, and in some cases just the purpose of being able to worship. So most of the time in the Middle Ages, from what we can see, especially in the more early and high Middle Ages, pretty much all of the art that was created in Europe was for religious purposes. Now we know that paintings and sculptures and many of these artworks are going to portray Jesus and many Christian saints or people from the Bible, different characters. They are going to be created and placed in churches to support worship. Because most people could not read at this time, art was the way that the story of Jesus' life and religion in general in this part of the world was portrayed so that everyone could understand. You might not be able to read the Bible in Latin, or you might not be able to read it in its original context, but you can look at a painting, a mosaic, you can look at a statue and understand what's being portrayed. Here are some examples of art early on. This is in 1275, and this depicts Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus as a baby. But one of the things you're going to notice in a lot of this early art is that even though Jesus is very young, he typically is portrayed with very kind of more mature and adult features, as the Christians believed he was the Son of God and holy. So that's one of the things that you will notice. And then on the opposite side of this, we have Jesus being crucified on the cross. And then, of course, we have his mother, witnessing this. And so it's sort of the two parts of this story. We also have all kinds of stained glass that was created throughout the Middle Ages that depicts all kinds of stories from the Bible. So this is from about 1200, and this is the Old Testament story of Noah and the ark. You can see the dove here. And so this was something people would be able to see, and they would recognize that story. Now, one of the most important creations during this time period were cathedrals. Cathedrals, are very large churches that were built for worship and really to just shock people in amazement. Now, these are going to be the absolutely tallest buildings in any community in Europe at the time. Some are even taller than a 30-story building. Most of them were built in the shape of the cross, as you can see here, but of course there were no drones, airplanes, anything like that, helicopters that these pictures would be taken from during that time. So they built these in the shape of the cross really as a signal to God, not really as something that they would ever see themselves. Now, these cathedrals were mainly constructed from about 1150 to about 1400, and during this time period, cathedrals were designed in the Gothic style of architecture. They were built to appear as if they were rising to heaven, and Gothic architecture had quite a few interesting characteristics. So we'll watch a clip about that a bit later. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that to be able to hold up the weight of such impressive buildings, new types of engineering and architecture had to be created. So these stone arches that are used to support the walls of the building are called, I kid you not, flying buttresses. What a great name. Now, I actually took this picture when I was in Italy in 2018, and this shows what these look like. Now, essentially, because they built taller roofs, larger walls, and had all kinds of stained glass windows, these outside supports kept there from being so many columns on the inside. and it allowed there to be much more open and taller spaces. We also know that beautiful stained glass windows let in colorful light and really directed people's eyes towards heaven. And again, these windows were often decorated with stories from the Bible. This is one of the most famous sets of stained glass windows in Sainte-Chapelle, which is in Paris, France, that was created in the mid-1200s. Absolutely amazing. Here are a couple other stained glass windows. On the left, we see one from Canterbury Cathedral in England from the 1200s that shows the death and crucifixion of Jesus. And then this one is actually a more modern window from St. Andrews University in Scotland, another one depicting Noah's Ark. Now, with all of this in mind, it's really important to understand that it took hundreds of workers and craftsmen years and years to construct cathedrals. They did all of this by hand with none of the modern technology that we have today. You don't have a drill that's powered by battery or electricity. You don't have a power sander. You don't have cranes in the way that we do today. All of this is very difficult and dangerous work, and people did die in the construction of these cathedrals. Now, on average, it took anywhere from 50 to 100 years to complete some cathedrals. Others took more than 200 years. So there are people that literally started constructing these cathedrals knowing they would never see the end result. Now, the photo I have here is me in a bell tower, which is about 287 feet tall, looking across at a very famous cathedral, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, Italy. So, I don't know if you can tell, but there are people here at the observation deck. I'm directly across from them, and these are people on the street. So these were massive constructions that were done in just a time period that seems like almost impossible to actually build anything at this height. Now, there are other pretty famous cathedrals throughout the world. This particular one is probably the most famous. This is Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France. Its construction began in 1163 and was completed in 1345. Now, this story has a really interesting history. But unfortunately, that story has continued in a little bit of a tragic way in the last few years. This is the cathedral from the side. You can see the flying buttresses. And this picture is taken because the river is right here. So this is taken from a boat. So unfortunately, there was a fire at this cathedral. So the fire, you can see, we'll watch a couple videos about it, happened in April of 2019. Now, this restoration work started pretty much immediately because parts of the building were saved because of the flying buttresses, but it was a very devastating fire. Now, a lot of this restoration work was completed over the years, and it was reopened to the public just this past December in 2024. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the topic of education. Now, we know that during the Middle Ages, there were large amounts of the population who did not have the opportunity to go to school or to have a formal education. However, learning did survive. Basically, during the Middle Ages, most learning is going to take place in religious buildings because these are where the most educated people in the whole area are going to live. We know that Charlemagne started the tradition because he encouraged the church to teach people to read and write. Instead of writing in capital letters like the Romans did, we even know that during this time, this is when the use of lowercase letters begins too. So I think that's kind of cool. You can see from the Latin and Roman to Latin during the Middle Ages and the change of writing in capital and lowercase letters. Now, even though Charlemagne kind of wanted all kinds of people to learn to read and write, ultimately we know it was generally the wealthy who are going to be able to hire tutors or send their children to the cathedrals or to monks to be able to teach them to read and write. So we're going to see that literacy is not widespread. However, there are families where Because of their financial status and power, they're able to send their kids to be educated, and in some cases, even for higher learning. So, beginning in the 1200s, we know that cathedral schools often inspire the creation of universities. So, these would be places for higher learning, studying subjects like Latin and logic, geometry, different types of math, astronomy, music, and books were hand copied and very rare. They were incredibly valuable and expensive. So teachers often had to read to students and students had to memorize. And so this is a depiction of what it would be like to go to one of these universities. And so it was definitely a rarity, but did happen. Now, moving on to something a little exciting, we're going to talk about holidays in the medieval world. Basically, there were a lot of festivals and fairs, and a lot of these celebrations are connected to the church, and that's why the word holiday comes from holy day. Get it? So during the Middle Ages, for example, Christmas was a holiday that was celebrating the birth of Jesus. It lasted for 12 days, and generally on Christmas Day, people attended church, and then they enjoyed feasts that often were held on manors by the Lord. So the higher ranking, wealthier landowners would oftentimes provide food and festivities during this holiday. Now, I would say that Easter might have even been more important to the medieval people than Christmas. Christians are going to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus rising from the dead. And again, there would be church services, feasting, and games. And during this time, eggs were used to symbolize new life. So if you've ever dyed Easter eggs before or decorated them, this is where that tradition comes from. Now, taking a look at the people who were part of the church, we're going to now focus in on a group called monks and nuns. This is where there would be men and women who would choose to kind of leave normal life and devote their entire lives to God and to the church and serving others. So monks are men who are going to join monasteries that are going to be religious institutions, and nuns are women who lived in convents doing the same thing. They devoted their lives to prayer and service to fellow Christians, and there were many different groups of monks and nuns. For example, this is Saint Benedict, and some monks belong to the order of the Benedictines that was founded by him. And there's others as well, Franciscans, and on and on. Now, the lives of monks and nuns were pretty interesting. They basically spent their lives in prayer, study, and work, and in some cases even would take periods of vows of silence and poverty where they would not speak and would focus on prayer. They attended 8 church services every day. They cared for the poor and sick. They farmed the land. They tended gardens. They raised livestock. They sewed clothing to be able to survive. And some monks worked to copy books by hand. And they were the ones who created these beautiful illuminated manuscripts. Now, it's called illuminated because it looks like there's almost light on the page, where they're going to use gold leaf and other very important paint colors. We see that in addition to this, monks were often, and even nuns, copying rare documents to keep knowledge of the past alive. And then more than that, they would often be the only medical care in an area. So people would come there. They would even sometimes come there if they were in trouble, or if they were traveling, they would stay at a monastery over the night for safety and to be able to have a room. Now, with all of this in mind that we've learned for the past 2 days about the importance of the Roman Catholic Church to the Middle Ages and to the people there are going to be some challenges. In fact, the Roman Catholic Church was part of most people's lives in Western Europe during this time period, and the church did many good things to help people to spread learning and to give hope. But unfortunately, as the church becomes more and more powerful, some church leaders are going to be tempted into greed and corruption. And so we know that this was something that did become a problem. Because the Bible at this time was only written in the Latin language, most people could not read it for themselves to know what it really taught. So people trusted the leaders of the church to tell them the truth. But sometimes the leaders either didn't follow the Bible, they taught their own beliefs instead of God's word, or they sort of changed things to make it sort of meet what they wanted it to say. Now, eventually, these problems are going to lead to major change in Europe and the world with the Roman Catholic Church. And we're going to look at that more later.